Crown Peak is pleased to release the Patchworks connector for Fredhopper. Patchworks is an industry-leading integration platform as a service vendor with a specialist capability required within the commerce space. In launching this connector, Fredhopper customers can easily connect with hundreds of third-party platforms as part of their customer experience architecture, making initial implementation, re-platforming, or organic growth simple. The Patchworks connector for Fredhopper works by wrapping Fredhopper's common item data pipeline API and providing connectivity to the Patchworks ecosystem. Fredhopper customers can then build process flows within the Patchworks UI to connect to and process data into Fredhopper from hundreds of third-party vendors. The no-code, drag-and-drop data modeling capabilities of Patchworks remove or greatly reduce the traditional data transformation and manipulation tasks typically associated with these types of platform integrations. Guy Brown will now run us through a comprehensive demonstration of how the Fredhopper connector for Patchworks can be used in production scenarios. Please note that your own implementation will vary, and this should be treated as purely an example. Further documentation is available via the Patchworks team.
As a customer, I can come in and log into the dashboard. I'll be taken to my homepage, and from here, I can start to use the connector along with connectors from other systems to build process flows. So if I pop out the menu here, we have a couple of items here that we can take a look at. We've got the process flow section in the marketplace. If I expand the process flows, you can see the two important things we're going to take a look at here are the connectors and instances in the process flows. So the connectors are where you configure the connector for each one of the systems that you're trying to connect together. And then the process flows are how you use those connectors. So you build workflows that use the connectors that take data from one system, transform it, and push it to another system. But first, we're going to take a quick look at the marketplace to see what kind of connectors we have available to us. So you can see here that I already have a couple of connectors installed. I already have the Crown Peak Product Discovery connector installed, and I have the Shopify connector installed. I also have access to lots of other connectors in the marketplace. So in here, we have connectors for all the major commerce platforms, such as Salesforce, Commerce Cloud, BigCommerce, Commerce Tools, Shopline, Shopware, and much more. There are also connectors for systems like NetSuite, fulfillment and logistics systems, marketing tools such as HubSpot, MailChimp, helper tools such as SFTP, OpenAI, Jira, Google Sheets, and lots more. Once you've found the connector that you want to use, you simply click the Install button and it will be added to the Connectors and Instances page within the dashboard. On this page, you can see all of the connectors that are listed that you've currently got installed, and from here you can add an instance of that connector. An instance is the configuration you need to connect to a particular instance, environment, or shop. So for Fredhopper, this would be the tenant and the environment. So you could have multiple instances for both test, stage, and live. Or something like Shopify, it might be connections to different stores, such as the UK store or the US store. So now I'm going to create a new instance so we can start testing some process flows. To create a new instance, you will follow the step-by-step process. First, give it a name. Next, configure the time zone and date formats. For CIDP, we have configured OAuth authentication. On this screen, the customer can add the connection details that they would have been provided by their CSM or technical consultant. For this demo, we are going to use the TC Sandbox environment. We have 4 bits of information we need to provide: the tenant ID, the environment, the client ID, and the client secret. I'm going to add the details here for the TC Sandbox. Now I can click Create to create my instance. Now that we have an instance of our connector, we can start to build some process flows. Process flows in Patchworks are a way to define if, when, what, and how data is synced between applications. Process flows are built by dragging and dropping automated shapes onto a canvas and then configuring them as required. But first, let's take a little look at the details of our connector. If I click through to the endpoint section here, we can see which of the endpoints will be available to us when we're building our process flows. So now we are going to go ahead to the process flow section and create a new process flow. Our process flow will send some items to CIDP and then activate a catalog. We are now taken to the process flow canvas. Before we start, we are going to go to the settings page and add a few variables that we can use throughout our flow. Now that we have our process flow ready, we can start to add some shapes to the canvas. You can see the first shape on the canvas is a trigger. This can be used to schedule a flow to run at a periodic time, for example, nightly for a full catalog sync. And then if you click here, you can add further shapes. Here is a view of all the different shapes that are available. So we can pull data from a connector. We can do things like filter the data, route the data, split the data up, use flow control to separate through chunks of data one by one, map different data items together, set variables, run other process flows, and lots more. Using a combination of these shapes, customers will be able to build their data integrations to send data to Fredhopper. For example, a customer who is using Shopify could use the Shopify connector to pull product data from Shopify, use the filter, split, and map shapes to transform the data in Shopify's format to the data that Fredhopper expects, and use the product discovery connector to send the data to Fredhopper. So what I'm going to do now is run through a simple example of sending some data through to Fredhopper. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a set variable shape. I'm going to add some values to the variables that we can use throughout our process flow. So I'm going to set schema name to product. Set category tree name to catalog 01. And then set nested schema name to variants. I'm now going to add a connector shape. And I'm going to pick our TC sandbox. And then if I click here, it will list all of the endpoints that are available to me to use. I'm going to use the list catalog endpoint to retrieve a list of all the catalogs we currently have. So if I click test here to initialize the flow, you'll see it's running through each step of my flow. And then I can click on that tick icon to get details of what happened. So if I click on the tick icon for list catalogs, I can see the payload that we've retrieved back from Fredhopper. And you can see this is a list of all of the catalogs we have. We have one active catalog and one inactive catalog. So what I want to do now is delete the inactive catalog so I can create a new catalog, add some items to it, and then activate that catalog. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a split function. I'm going to add the word catalogs in here. So what this will do is it will use the payload from the previous step and it will remove the top level catalogs item to give me an array of 2 items. I'm now going to add a filter shape. And what this filter shape is going to do is filter the inactive catalog so I can remove it. So I want to filter on the state field, and I want to filter by inactive catalogs. So again, if we run this, we can go through each step and see what's happened. So if I click on the tick icon for the shape, we can see we've got our new payload, which is an array of those two items. And then I click on the filter and click on the payload, you can see now I just have my inactive catalog. Now I have the data for my inactive catalog, I can use our connector to delete the catalog. So again, picking the connector shape, picking the TC Sandbox instance. From my list of endpoints, I'm going to search for the delete catalog endpoints. And you'll see this endpoint needs a variable which is mandatory for catalog version. So I can use the payload from my previous step to pass in the catalog version for deletion. Click Save. Now I have my delete catalog. I'm not going to go through and test this one because I don't want to yet delete the catalog. So what I'm going to do here as well is click on the settings for the shape here. I'm going to select skip and save so I can skip the shape when testing the process flow. So the next step that we're going to undertake is to update both the schema and the category tree. Now, normally this data would come from an external system, like a commerce system, especially in the case of the category trees. But what we're going to do in this instance is use a feature in Patchworks called a manual payload. And what I can do here is copy in some JSON that will act as my payload. This happens to be some JSON that I've pre-prepared that is the category tree. And then we're going to add a map shape. And what the map shape allows you to do is transform the data from one format to the other. So for example, taking the payload that comes from e-commerce platforms such as Shopify and taking the JSON format from Shopify and mapping it to the format that we need for Fredhopper. Rather than me build this one by one, I'm going to import a map that I've already created. So we've got our tree map here. So again, if I click through there, you can see this mapping that I've already created. In this instance, because I'm using manual payload, the data I've pasted in is in a very similar format that we need for Fredhopper anyway. But the one thing I have done is add this transformation. And what this transformation does is it takes our flow variable for tree name and maps that to the name in the source formatting. So it allows me to dynamically inject the name for this category tree. And the category tree name was set in the variables that I set earlier on. So now if I run that, you can see it's going to come through. It'll skip the delete catalog section because I don't want to delete the catalog just yet. And now we get to this section. And again, if I click on here, I can see the payload. And now we have catalog 1 there injected. Now, as mentioned, what you would normally do in this step would be to take the format that you received from your commerce platform and transform it to the format that you need for Fredhopper. So this potentially would be a lot more complicated in this scenario. And again, customers can use the import and export map section, so they could do it once and export it and then simply import it the next time they need to do it. We're now going to do the same for the item schema. So again, I'm going to create a manual payload and paste in my schema. And then I'm going to create another map and import my map for schemas. And if we take a look at this one, you can see same kind of format, mapping the source to the target. In this case, I have two transformations to use my schema name variable and my nested schema name variable. And then the last thing we can do is add a new connector shape, pick our TC sandbox, find the update schema endpoint, And you can see we have to provide it the schema name as a variable. So we'll use our flow variable for schema name, and then we'll click save. And if we take a quick look at the shape now, you can see we've got a parameter that's also been added that we can change. So in this case, it's Fredhopper validation. It's currently set to true, so I could change this to false if I needed, but I'm going to keep it as true for now. So now if we run this, what it's going to do is step through each shape. It's going to update the schema, update the category tree, and we're good to move on to the next step. So if we go to add a new shape and pick connector again. So far we've retrieved a list of catalogs, we've deleted the inactive catalog, we've updated our category tree and updated our schema. The next step is to then create a new catalog. So I'm going to find the create new catalog endpoint. And as you can see, there's a number of variables that I have to provide at this point. So we've already set our schema name and our category name, but we also need to provide schema version and category version, which we don't have at the moment. So I'm going to cancel that and then come back to revisit the category tree shape and the schema shape. So if I click on this tick again, you can see we have our payload that is being passed to that endpoint. If we also look at the response, we can see what the endpoint is responding. So we have in the body of the response version number 12. So this is the information that we need to pass through to the create catalog endpoint. If I go to the settings of that shape and scroll down, there is a few options here for response handling, and one of those is save the response as the payload. So I'm going to take that option, and essentially what that will do is it will save this response as the payload to pass through to the next shape. If I click save there, and what I'm going to do here is add another set variable shape. And if we go and click edit here and we pick the variable that we want, which would be category tree version, and then in here we can use the payload to populate that version. So now my category tree version will be populated in this variable as a result of calling that method. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same for item schema. And now we have those two variables set, we can go ahead and add the create catalog endpoint and add those values. And now we can click save and we can test that flow. Before I do that, what I'm going to do is re-enable the delete catalog shape. Main reason for this is we can only have two catalogs at once. So my create catalog will fail without deleting the previous inactive catalog. So I'm going to step through that again now by initializing the flow. And then we can see that was successful. So if we come here and click this tick again, we can look at the response we got back from that endpoint, and you can see it was successful and it's passed us back version 42. We're probably going to need this in the next step, so I'm going to change this endpoint to save that response as the payload. And I'm going to use that payload to set our catalog version variable. We're now ready to start adding items to the catalog. So I'm going to click to add a shape again. You'd normally use a connector shape to pull products from a commerce platform and use some of the other shapes to manipulate that data before pushing them into CIDP. You would probably want to use something like the flow control shape to batch those products into batches of 5, 10, 15, 20, and send them in batches. You're also going to want to make use of the filter shape and the map shape to transform the data that you get from the commerce platform into the right format to push into CIDP. Potentially, if the data is coming from multiple sources, so not just from one commerce platform, but maybe data from multiple connectors, you would probably also use the add to cache and load to cache function to create snippets of the payload to add to cache, come back, update that cache from data from other connectors until you have the full payload that you want to send to CIDP ready. In this case, I'm just going to use a manual payload to keep things simple for our demonstration. So I'm going to copy the JSON payload I have for my product data in there and click Save. I'm going to add a map shape to transform my data. Now, the JSON that I copied in was of the correct format that CIDP expects. I do, however, need to manipulate the payload to pass through some of the variables that we set earlier on in the flow. As I mentioned before, when you're taking data from a commerce system to then push to CIDP, you would use this map shape to transform that data format from one side to the other. So although our task is fairly simple because our payload to begin with is of the correct shape, there will be a lot more mapping rules that you'll probably need to add here to transform one source payload into the target payload. Again, because we're in a demo and to make it easier, I've already got a map that I've pre-prepared, so I'm going to choose that map and we'll take a quick look and see what that's actually doing. So we can see here on the source endpoint, we're taking all of the main parts of the JSON array and pushing it over to the target endpoint that we're going to send to CIDP. But we do have a few transforms as before, and that's to inject some of the variables that we created earlier on in the flow into the JSON payload so that we can send that to CIDP so it has the correct values. In this case, you can see here we're passing through the catalog version that we retrieved from our create catalog endpoint, adding it to the JSON payload that will then send to the upsert items endpoint. So now we've got that, we can add that connector shape. We'll search for the endpoint we need, which is upsert items. And now we can save this. And then when this shape is run, it will use the payload that we just created to send to this endpoint. One side point here is you'll notice on each of the endpoints, there's this view help button. If I click that, what it's going to do is take us to the documentation on the Crown Peak documentation side that explains how to use that endpoint, all of the query parameters, the headers, and the request body. So if a person is unsure what format data to send, how to use the endpoint, then they can use the help function to let them know. And then finally, what we need to then do is activate our catalog, because now we have all of the steps that we need to add items to a catalog. The next thing we're going to do is activate it. So again, we've used the product discovery connector. We've picked our instance. We're going to search for the activate catalog endpoint. We can see we have to give it a catalog version, and we can use our variable that we've previously set. And then the final thing I'm going to do with this flow is to add another endpoint from our connector to get the active catalog version so we can see what the new version is after we've created our catalog and activated. So you can see there we're calling the get active catalog version endpoint. And then the final thing we need to do is just run and test this flow. I'm going to click on the initialize flow, and it's going to go through all of the different steps. And there you can see it's gone through and it's completed the entire run through getting a list of the current catalogs, finding the inactive catalog, deleting the inactive catalog, updating both the item schema and the catalog tree, then creating a catalog, adding items to that catalog, and then activating that catalog. So you can see how easy it is for customers to build their data integrations using Patchworks. A flow like this could be used to perform incremental updates as and when products get updated in commerce platforms. At the moment, this is set to be scheduled to run every hour. However, customers have the flexibility to run it on different schedules or to use things like webhooks, callbacks, and event listeners to check when data has been updated and trigger this. Customers can also use the different parts of our API to run different types of process flows. So for example, for nightly uploads of product data, they could use our batch items API. This is an example process flow that I've created that demonstrates using the batch API. So you can see here, we're getting the active catalog, we're setting some variables, we're creating a batch, adding some products to that batch, updating them, deleting them, modifying them, calling a batch ingestion, getting the batch import. So you can see it's perfectly possible for customers to build out multiple process flows to achieve different things, whether it's nightly product syncs or incremental updates, or calling some of the feedback API to check on processes throughout the day so they can act upon it.